There is so much I want to talk about this week, and I will try to get it all in. But first, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to this, our 100th episode. When we started this, I wanted to be a bullhorn for the message of liberty that this country was founded on. So thank you all for listening and now watching on the YouTube channel. On this 100th episode, we're going to examine the concept of risk and how much risk we assume on a day-to-day basis. We're also going to tackle the question of whether or not we should send our children to school in the fall. And we'll ask the question why some teachers' unions oppose that. And racism seems to be acceptable these days as long as your bigotry is directed at the right people. We will get into all of that and more. I'm Biggie, and this is the Liberty Cast. Ladies and gentlemen, like I said last week, this is war, and the left has launched an all-out offensive on anyone and everyone who doesn't think the way they believe that you should. This is evident in the way that they are gaslighting us on this Chinese coronavirus. They're attempting to scare us into submission with reporting on the number of cases spiking, pushing the false narrative that masks are a panacea and not wearing one puts people's lives in danger. They want to make sure your kids stay at home and don't get, well, I was going to say a quality education, but unless your kids go to a private school or a charter school, there's a really good chance that they're not getting the greatest education anyway. And we'll get to that a little later on, as well as the broader issue of risk. But first, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Folks, we're at a tipping point in this country. It's as if we've entered Superman's Bizarro world. Now, please allow me a point of personal privilege to nerd out for a minute. For those of you who are not familiar with Superman or Bizarro World is a world where beauty is hated, ugliness is revered, and it's a crime to make anything perfect. Does that sound familiar to anyone? We're vilifying cops, and not just the bad ones who deserve to be vilified, but the profession as a whole. To the point where there are calls to defund the police across the country, and cops, especially at the NYPD, are retiring in droves. The ugliness of the Black Lives Matter and Antifa is celebrated. And now, according to the circuit attorney in St. Louis, it's a crime to defend your home from rioters. Now, don't tell me they were peaceful protesters, because when they broke down a gate to get on private property, as soon as you do that, you're no longer a peaceful protester. You're a rioter and should be dealt with as such. Now, really quick, I want to correct the record, because a few weeks ago, I told you that the McCluskeys were registered Democrats and supported Black Lives Matter. Well, that turns out to not be the case. The claim was based on a tweet by Benny Johnson, and we love Benny. Benny Johnson's funny. He's a great follow on Parler and Twitter. But he found donations from Mark McCluskey to Black Lives Matter on Open Secrets. And as it turns out, it was a different Mark McCluskey. I believe I believe he gave an interview where he refuted that claim and said that he was actually a registered Republican. I haven't been able to find it, but new information shows that he donated most to Republican candidates. So I just wanted to clear that up. And Benny Johnson has since deleted that tweet as well. So we have people being told it's a crime to defend your home in St. Louis. Meanwhile, in New York, Comrade De Blasio has disbanded the anti-crime unit, and crime has spiked to David Dinkins era levels. AOC contributes this to poverty and says that the rise in crime is due to bread theft or some such nonsense. Meanwhile, Comrade De Blasio is simply oblivious to the crime wave sweeping his city. Now, I know he announced the Take Back the Block initiative, but that's little more than a PR stunt. Sending community leaders out with cops, no cop is going to do any serious police work with a civilian in tow. And if something were to jump off while one of those civilians was with one of those officers, it would put and the officer had to respond, it would put that civilian directly in the line of fire. Now, last week, 60 people were shot, 10 fatally, including a 1-year-old named Devell Gardner. And Comrade De Blasio somehow thinks that his policies are making New York safer.
If you looked at what we were hearing day after day in 2013, you would have imagined it would have been impossible to end the broken and unconstitutional policy of stop and frisk. We were sold a bill of goods. We were lied to every day, being told that if we ended that policy, there would be crime and chaos everywhere. And thank God most of us didn't listen to that hype. We changed something unjust and we became a fairer city. And guess what? We became a safer city at the same time. Because fairness and safety have to walk hand in hand. People said that if we reduced incarceration and ended the era of mass incarceration, we would be endangered. It was the other way around, my friends. We now have fewer people in our jails than any time since World War II. And we are safer for it and better for it.
Wow. He is completely oblivious to what's happening outside the bubble of his armed security detail. Now, from June to July, in that month, shootings are up 130%. Burglaries are up 118%, and murders are up 30%. He has no worries about the crime wave affecting his city because he has a security detail at least 8 deep, sometimes 10. And Gracie Mansion is a fortress. But what about you? Residents of New York City don't have security details. That's ostensibly why they have some of the most stringent gun control laws in the country. They're easily in the top 5 most restrictive gun laws in the country. So how in the world is gun violence spiking like this? With their draconian gun laws, they should prevent all this, shouldn't they? Now, based on the laws that they do have in place, the criminals that they release from jail and the ones that they catch and then release because there's no bail anymore, they shouldn't be able to get their hands on the guns that they're using to hurt all of these people. Of course, I'm being sarcastic because obviously gun control doesn't work. Gun control laws have never worked. At least not how they want us to think that they work. They want us compliant and unquestioning while they metaphorically turn up the heat in the pot like they're boiling a lobster. Because they can't possibly actually believe that releasing criminals while at the same time making it nearly impossible for law-abiding citizens to own guns makes us safer. And when you say it out loud, when you say it out loud, it makes no sense. Folks, New York is falling apart, and he has zero interest in fixing it. Because if he did, he would follow the recommendations of community leaders and bring back the anti-crime unit. He would eliminate the need for a license to purchase a handgun, a license to purchase a long gun, whether that's a rifle or a shotgun, and a license to carry concealed. And yes, if you want to buy a handgun and a rifle to hunt and carry a concealed weapon, you have to obtain 3 separate licenses in New York City. And if he was interested in making it safer, he would make the fees for those licenses a lot more affordable. Right now, if you buy all those, you could buy a gun for what you spend on those licenses. Now, he's spoken extensively about how New York is the safest city and the NYPD is the finest in the world, and it should be sufficient to keep people safe, and therefore no one needs a gun to protect themselves. Now, as fine a department as the NYPD was, it was never sufficient to keep the entire city safe. And that's even less so now, with all the retirements and whatnot. It's as if there's an acceptable number of casualties, and even with the devolution of New York as it's happening right now, it hasn't reached a point that he finds untenable yet. Now, living in New York City is a huge risk right now on so many levels. Now, obviously, there's an element of risk that we assume in everything that we do. And if you think that living in New York City right now is worth the risk that it currently poses, then you're a better person than I am. I hate New York. I hated it even when it was safe, but that's a story for another time. Living in a free society involves risk. It's the price that we pay for that freedom. And we all pay it every day without a second thought. Unless, of course, you are engaged in some risky behavior or you have a job that involves an elevated level of risk, such as being a police officer or a firefighter. But we assume that risk willingly. When you drive to work every day, you assume the risk of getting into a fatal car crash. You mitigate that risk, hopefully, by paying attention and not texting while driving, etc. You take that risk because you believe that the reward, which is your paycheck at the end of the week, is worth the risk. When you go on vacation and you fly to your destination, you assume the risk of air travel because the reward of the vacation is going to be worth it. It's a trade-off. So, is the risk of catching the coronavirus worth going about business as usual? Or, to put it another way, is the risk too great to keep the economy open? I guess the first thing you would look at is how infectious is the virus? How does it spread? Who are the most vulnerable, and for those who do happen to catch it, what is the likelihood that you'll recover? Now, right now, the data tells us that it's quite infectious, that our most vulnerable are the elderly and those with otherwise compromised immune systems. We know it spreads through close contact and droplets when people sneeze or cough, sometimes even talk. But we also know that over 99% of the people who catch this virus fully recover. But somehow we've gotten to the point in society where people want everyone else to be responsible for their own well-being. Now, if you're wearing a mask and my lack of a mask, it should have no impact on you whatsoever. And we will get into mask mandates right after this break. People have been getting on my wife and me regarding our stance on mask wearing. Now, my initial reaction to the mask thing was, F that. I'm not wearing a mask. And all things being equal, I still won't wear one. And especially not because the government tells me that I have to. However, at the same time, I have a life to live. I have groceries and whiskey to buy. I have to go to the post office at least once a week, if not more often than that. And as much as I hate wearing one, if I want to live my life, if I want to do business, I'm going to have to wear one on occasion. And I've always said from the beginning, even though I hated wearing one, that if I have to do business in your establishment and you as a small business owner or any business owner require masks, I'm going to wear it. It's your business. You can refuse me service if I'm not wearing one, and I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly okay with that. I'll look for alternatives, but in the meantime, I'll wear it to do business with you. Now, if I owned a brick and mortar business, I would not require my patrons to wear one. And I'm also not going to be the guy to call you names and tell you that you're an idiot for wearing a mask. I know a lot of our leftist friends are fond of telling people how evil and stupid they are for not wearing one. And they're such tolerant individuals, aren't they? But I see all the memes and I see all the infographics telling us that we should wear one. But memes aren't data. Remember the exalted Dr. Fauci when he said this?
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course.
A study by the National Center for Biotechnology Information concluded that cloth masks, which is what most people wear when they're out and about, are ineffective against respiratory infections. Doctors Lisa Brousseau and Margaret Stetzma, and forgive me if I'm saying your names wrong, please, but they're both experts in respiratory protection and infectious diseases, and they're from the University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. And they have concluded that masks for everyone is not based on sound data. They've concluded that cloth masks and face coverings are likely to have a very limited impact on lowering COVID-19 transmission because the cloth masks have minimal ability to prevent the emission of small particles. I mean, when you speak and you spew the droplets, and they offer limited personal protection with respect to small particle inhalation. So they should not be recommended as a replacement for physical distancing or reducing time in enclosed spaces. Enclosed spaces. That sounds like school, doesn't it? Well, we're going to take another quick break and be right back and explain why, if you have children, you should send them to school in the fall. Children should be in school. They need to be in school this fall. And there's a myriad of reasons for this, but simply put, it's what's best for them in the short term and the long term. In the short term, because they need to be in school learning what they can. And they need to be socializing with other children. Dan Bongino told a story about his how his 8-year-old youngest daughter is not handling the isolation well. And I mean, very few 8-year-olds can. But it helps the families as well, because forcing parents to work and homeschool their children or supervise their online learning ensures that one of those things is going to suffer. Either the parent's job or the child's education. And sometimes maybe even both. And all indications are right now that online learning for kids amounts to no learning at all, because they don't log in. And think about it. Adults who enroll in online schools, if they're not disciplined, they're not going to learn anything either, because they won't log in. So what's the resistance to reopening? Well, in Los Angeles, the teachers union there showed their butts in a huge way. They issued a set of demands that they wanted in place before they would support reopening schools. None of those demands had anything to do with what's best for educating children. Here's a list of what they're demanding. They want privately operated or publicly funded charter schools shut down. They want police defunded. They want Medicare for all government-run health care passed. A statewide wealth tax implemented. Housing for homeless fully funded. Financial support for undocumented students and families, and a federal bailout. Because the CARES Act, the CARES and HEROES Acts provided funding for K through 12 students, but fell far short of what would be needed to rescue districts and state and local governments. What does any of that have to do with the needs of children in Los Angeles? This is just a typical leftist power play where they never let a crisis go to waste. But it's even more sickening because they're using children as a political football. Unbelievable. But is there a valid reason for keeping schools closed that does not involve a Marxist agenda? Well, let's take a look at some data. Now, last week I said that the studies on how children contract and transmit the virus and how they fare in terms of symptoms and severity of their illness are limited. And that's true. That's still true. But there are 3 studies that I came across in my research: Germany, Iceland, and Ireland, and they all tell the same story. Children fare quite well if they catch the virus, and they are not likely to pass it on if they do catch it. The study out of Ireland is actually titled "No Evidence of Secondary Transmission of COVID-19 from Children Attending School in Ireland 2020." Okay, seems pretty straightforward. Now, quoting from the study, "Children are thought to be vectors for the transmission of many respiratory diseases, including influenza. It was assumed that this would be true for COVID-19 also. To date, however, evidence of widespread pediatric transmission has failed to emerge." Okay, well, it goes on in the conclusion. "These findings suggest that schools are not a high-risk setting for transmission of COVID-19 between pupils or between staff and pupils." That seems pretty straightforward. That seems pretty definitive. Now, it wasn't a huge sample size, but still, the results seem pretty conclusive. Now, the German study took samples from 1,500 students between the ages of 14 and 18, and over 500 staff aged 30 to 66, and this was spread over 13 different schools. Of those tested, 5 reported that they had already tested positive for the virus, and then 7 more during the course of the study tested positive, for a total of 12. Now, just over 2,000 is, again, not a huge sample size, but 12 positive cases out of over 2,000 is barely significant statistically. Now, really quick, the Iceland study, they tested 13,080 people, including 848 children under 10, and none of those children tested positive. The donut. And just in case you're thinking that these studies in these other countries have no significance to what's going on in the United States, listen to what these pediatricians here in the United States had to say about sending their children to school.
We are hearing a lot from government officials as schools look to reopen during this pandemic, but it's paramount that we also hear from public health experts.
As schools struggle with reopening safely, NBC News reached out to 5 top pediatricians across the country, a random sampling of doctors, to find out just how dangerous the coronavirus is for kids. Would you let your kids go back to school?
I will. My kids are looking forward to it.
Yes. Period. Absolutely.
Absolutely. As much as I can.
Without a hesitation.
Without a hesitation, yes.
I have no concerns about sending my child to school in the fall.
I would let my kids go back to school.
Dr. John Torres, NBC News.
They all said yes.
Did you catch the anchor's face at the end of that? If you're listening and not watching on YouTube, you should check it out. It is hilarious. He is pissed. So, yeah, I'm going to have to say that your children are going to be just fine and safe from the Chinese coronavirus. All right, let's move on because I have some other stuff I want to get to before we get you out of here. So let's take another quick break, and when we get back, we'll explore how racism seems to be acceptable these days. I'm sure many of you have heard about this guy, Nick Cannon, and his comments. He is the former Mr. Mariah Carey. Now, if you have heard but didn't know that he used to be married to her, that fact becomes even more significant. Nick Cannon has been a D-list celebrity for a long time now, and his big come-up was managing to get Mariah Carey to marry him. I don't know how he did it, but as bat guano crazy as she is, she was and remains one of my favorite singers ever, and at the time she was a superstar. Nick Cannon was at the time, and essentially still is, a nobody. But that marriage was more of a shock than when Whitney Houston married Bobby Brown. But listen to what Mr. Mariah Carey had to say on his podcast.
Melanin comes with compassion. Melanin comes with soul that we call it soul. We soul brothers and sisters. That's the melanin that connects us. Right. So the people that don't have it are a little, and I'm gonna say this carefully, are a little less. I'm bringing it all the way back around to Minister Farrakhan, to where they may not have the compassion or the when they were sent to the mountains of Caucasus, when they didn't have the power of the sun, that the sun then started to deteriorate them. So then they're acting out of fear. They're acting out of low self-esteem. They're acting out of a deficiency. So therefore, the only way that they can act is evil. The only way they have to rob, steal, rape, kill, and
fight or flight,
in order to survive.
Exactly.
So then these people who didn't have what we had, they had to be savages. They had to be barbaric. Because they're in these Nordic mountains. They're in these rough torrential environments, so they're acting as animals.
Right.
So they're the ones that are actually closer to animals. They're the ones that are actually the true savages, and then they built up such this I don't want to say warrior, but they built up such this conquering barbaric mentality.
Is that not the very definition of racist? Condemning an entire group of people based on their race? Thinking an entire group of people is less than based on the immutable characteristics that they were born with? Apparently that's not what got him fired, though, surprisingly. But before we get into what actually did get him fired, according to CBS Viacom, I said his marriage to Mariah Carey was significant. I'm sure now, based on those comments, you understand why, if you didn't before, at least in this context. Because Mariah Carey is biracial. Her mother is white and her father is black. So he just called his former mother-in-law an animal, a barbarian, a savage. Now add to that the fact that he has 2 children with Mariah Carey as well. So are his children part savage too? I'm sure he would say that that's completely different. But I don't think that it is. Now I know the left is going to say this is whataboutism, but just imagine another D-list celebrity, Vanilla Ice. Imagine if he had said that melanated people, to use Nick Cannon's word, were more like animals, savages, had no souls. What do you think the response would be? Cancel culture would mow him down with the quickness. He would never work again, anywhere, in any industry, ever. But here's why CBS Viacom supposedly fired him.
Because the Semitic people
are black people.
So y'all get that clarity. We're gonna say that again.
Now,
the Semitic people are black people.
Who are they? When we speak of, because this is where it truly is, and we talk about those the 6 corporations. When we go as deep as the Rothschilds, centralized banking, those the 13 families, the bloodlines that control everything, even outside of America. When we talk about the people who, if we were truly the children of Israel, and we're defining who the Jewish people are, because I feel like if we actually can understand that construct, then we can see that there is no hate involved. When we talk about the lies, the deceit, how the fake dollar controls all of this, then maybe we can get to the reason why they wanted to silence you, why they wanted to silence Minister Farrakhan, and they want to throw that we are having hate speech when it's never hate speech, when it's not. You can't be anti-Semitic when the Semitic, when we are the Semitic people, when we are the same people that who they want to be, that's our birthright. So if that's truly our birthright, there's no hate involved.
So his comments about white people were completely racist, and his comments about Jewish people are completely anti-Semitic, despite what he's claiming in that clip. Now, considering how many times he mentioned Louis Farrakhan in this interview, and it was a lot. If you watch the whole thing, it's 90 minutes. But I'm going to conclude that he is now a Muslim. And if he is now a Muslim, that explains everything. All right, one last quick point before we get you out of here. And I want to circle back to guns for a minute. Remember David Hogg?
Who?
Yeah, his 15 minutes were 15 minutes too long. But he took to Twitter the other day to tweet at the NRA, actually to respond to a tweet by the NRA. Because the NRA, they sent out a tweet, quote, "The AR-15 is the modern day musket, an everyday gun for everyday citizens." And Mr. Hogg responded as only he can. Quote, 6 minutes, 20 seconds is all it took for the shooter at my high school to fire over 100 rounds from his AR-15 and shoot 34 people. In that same amount of time, even the most trained person would have only been able to fire 18 rounds with a musket. Modern day musket my ass. Of course, he misses the point completely. It's not literally a musket. Now, the AR-15 is similar enough to the M4 that our military uses that it can be considered along the same lines as a musket of that era, meaning that it can be used to defend your home or your property, and if necessary, be pressed into action to defend your country. But of course, David Hogg missing the point is nothing new. But the best part of that was when Juanita Broderick pointed out his naked hypocrisy. She destroyed him and the entire anti-gun lobby with one tweet. Quote, "Where was your outrage when the leader of Chaz was handing out AR-15s like candy?" Which of course is on video, and none of the anti-Constitution zealots made a peep when that happened. I wonder why. Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's not the guns that they have a problem with. It's who has them. You. If you're on their side of this ideological war, it's all good. You can have all the guns. But if you're someone who just wants to defend yourself or your property against people like Raz Simone or Black Lives Matter or Antifa, well, then you're a menace, and you have to give them up. Hypocrites. Anyway, folks, we're out of time. There was a lot more I wanted to get to, and perhaps I'll do a video to address some of those things, like Twitter's bias getting exposed, or cancel culture, or an idea that was floated for contact tracing for guns. Yeah. So, anyway, thank you for watching, and for our audio-only listeners, thank you for listening. But before I go, I want to ask you to show some love for us over here at the Liberty Cast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go to YouTube and search for the Liberty Cast. We don't have a personalized URL yet, but we will. You can also check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, or any of the other popular podcast platforms, and subscribe and leave a review there. You can also find us on the web at thelibertycast.net and therightway.site. You can find us on social media, Parler, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's at The Liberty Cast on all 4 platforms. But again, folks, thank you all for listening. And as usual, until next time, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.